I'm Karen Wickery, and I want to welcome you to an author's talk with Randall Stross, who has just written a new book called Planet Google, and I hope you got a copy or will soon. Randy is a longtime business historian. He writes a column for the Sunday New York Times called Digital Domain that I think many of you have seen or should if you haven't, and has written quite a few books. He spent 6-8 months around here last year, at least that much, interviewing people. We were interested in Randy's view and cooperated with this book, helped him get interviews, and the book has just been published. And so Randy's going to talk about his thinking, his findings, what led him to this book, and then take your questions. And for those of you in other offices, you can go to the Dory page, go/Stross, S-T-R-O-S-S, and submit questions there. And I'm sure we'll fill the hour. So thank you again for coming. And here's Randy.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I've written other books before, but I've never had the chance to address my subject. My last book was about Thomas Edison, and he and I never got to meet. One of the things that I thought about as I was spending time here at Google was how Google's story is similar or dissimilar to that of Microsoft's. And I have some thoughts about that now that I'm at the end of the process. What I thought I'd do is share with you a few general thoughts. This is a challenge for me to try to come up with something that you don't already know. The one thing I can offer is an outsider's perspective on the company and its experience. Maybe you already know that too, how Google looks from the outside. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking at you. I do want to hear your questions and have a conversation. The central thesis of the book is Google has expanded well beyond web search. And in the course of expanding and working toward that all-encompassing mission of organizing the world's information, Google presents the world with a set of questions we've never grappled with before because information has never been so well organized. And even though information is good, and one would think, filling out the syllogism, more information should be even better, there are complications. And in the course of assembling a story of how Google has added, category by category, new kinds of information, I saw surprises. Surprises that were experienced by team members who were actually launching the products, surprises on the part of society as it was offered new capabilities. There are misunderstandings. But I will argue misunderstandings can be as politically potent as legitimate concerns. And so how the world perceives Google is a mixture of legitimate concerns and misunderstandings. And you at Google are not always going to be able to sort out. You're not always going to be able to point out, well, here are the real concerns, or these are false concerns. And let me say at the outset, I'm as gentle an observer as you're going to find. New York Magazine just published a generally very positive review of my book. I'm very pleased. There were some generous compliments paid. But the reviewer ended the review dinging me with the following. Stross is a little soft, however, on the potential danger of Google. Although it has done a plausible job so far of living up to its unofficial motto, don't be evil, the company's info hoarding has lured it into worrisome territory. Medical records, Google Health, online purchase histories, Google Checkout, recordings of phone conversations, Grand Central, and even genomics, 23andMe. It has come into conflict with and tried to copy or buy every other major web entity, Microsoft, Facebook, Wikipedia, YouTube. It goes on, and ends, this litany of areas that are worrisome, ends by saying, when you operate on such a massive scale, even the most minor issues become huge. every questionable judgment, every little risk operates at scale as well, which I think is an acute observation. The scale does matter. And if you think back to Microsoft, circa 1995, before its antitrust difficulties weighed heavily on it, they'd started, but they hadn't become a dominant force suppressing its growth. Microsoft then was actually much less ambitious than Google is today. Why do I say that? Think about, what does a customer's relationship with Microsoft Office consist of? Some episodic purchases and downloads. Once you put Word on your machine, Microsoft is not on an ongoing basis interacting with you. You did what you wanted on your desktop, laptop. Something like Google Docs, by its nature, software as a service, means there is an ongoing relationship. And one of the things that I see has not been noticed is that it's not just that Google's organizing the world's information. There are all kinds of information. And the distinctions are important. And if you go from the very beginning with web search and you go all the way to, let's make Google Health the endpoint for a quick chronology, this is a very different kind of information than what web search is. Think about web search. You're indexing information that has been deliberately put in public space. It's intended to be read by as many people as want to read it. There aren't copyright issues, of course, but most importantly, it's impersonal information. Even if someone's blogging about their personal life, it's still impersonal in the sense that it is a one-to-many broadcast. It is a publication. Whereas Google Health, obviously involving medical records, is not a form of publication. At most, it would be a handful of your medical providers that would want to read that. You don't want your employer to read it. You want probably as small a circle of people to read your health records as would make it worthwhile to put them up there. And in order to expand its range of information gathering, Google has moved from indexing information that resides on other people's servers that was always intended to be read to storing information that had not started, that was intended to be read but in a different format, such as book search, and now is sitting on Google servers, to information that had been originally stored in digital form on someone's personal hard drives, but now is Google's inviting us to store on Google servers. In the course of adding these services, the nature of what is getting indexed, the nature of what kind of information is being organized has subtly but importantly changed. And in order to carry off this enterprise of organizing all the world's information, and there has never been a public announcement of any limit. There's been no category that I'm aware of information that Google has officially said, we're not going there. And one of the, I found, interesting things about the book search story is very early on, the decision was made to scan every book. Now, besides the mind-boggling cost considerations of such a thing, there was this other part to it that was brilliant, which is by going after all, you avoid having to choose which would open up all sorts of difficulties. It made it possible for Google to not have to be judgmental and say this book is more important than this one. And in a larger sense, by saying you're going to organize all the world's information, you're not making any public distinction about some kinds of information as being more valuable, more important than others. It's all good. But in order to carry out this enterprise, you have to maintain a level of trust that Microsoft never had to attempt to. I do tell the story in the book about Microsoft's hailstorm Some of you may remember its ill-fated attempt to try to, we would today call it, offer a cloud-based service involving people's personal information, and it was a disaster. I would argue that Google has been able to get much farther than Microsoft was ever able to, both conceptually and in implementation, in organizing far more information, far more sensitive nature, by having an image that was non-threatening, right down to the logo. Not just the name that's just one vowel away from giggle, but it is everything about the public persona of Google. The logo, the employee benefits, I would argue, have played a very important role in conveying a non-threatening image that has made it possible for Google to do so much without triggering a reaction, either on the parts of activist critics or the government. Microsoft could never have done what you have already done. So let me offer a thought experiment. Think about all the kinds of information that Google has organized. And instead of the servers belonging to Google, suppose they belong to a different company. Let us say, I'm just going to pick a company that you don't think of as a computer company, but let's say they could add an information services division. Halliburton. Now, if your immediate reaction is, well, that would be different. Tell me why. Why would it be different? Why is Google to be more trusted than a Halliburton or any other company? Or let's do another thought experiment. Let's say somehow Microsoft was able to do it. Everything you have done, let's say Microsoft was able to do it. Would that make any difference from society's perspective? Or because of what Microsoft does in marketing, Windows, somehow that would lead us to be concerned about how they're holding on to our information of other kinds. The other thing that has helped Google, I think, and which is totally out of your control, is there has never been a large enough data leak at some other company that has made security issues front and center for people like my mom. We all know of a pretty regular flow of headlines relating to this employee left that laptop with this number of Social Security numbers of employees or former employees or customers somewhere that disappeared. And it's regular enough so that it doesn't actually make all that big an impact at this point. But were there to be a leak of centralized data that would have demonstrable negative repercussions? That's the other thing about data leaks, is the numbers disappear and then that's the last you hear about them. And the company that suffered the loss extends some type of 3 years of subscription to the credit rating agencies, and that's the last you hear of it. But it is possible to conceive of something that would really unsettle a large number of people. And I think that would have a huge impact on Google. In a way, the incremental nature of Google's expansion and its attaining its current size without a news story that causes everyone to be concerned has enabled Google to reach this point with only the beginnings of concerns. I think the "Don't be evil" slogan is misdirected. And it's the one thing I'm often asked about when I'm making the rounds and doing the book tour. I did an op-ed piece for the San Francisco Chronicle that came out, and they slapped this headline, "Is Google evil?" That wasn't my headline. I was as surprised as anyone. That is the question everyone is asking me. Do I think Google's evil? And the answer I give is, I don't think evil is the issue. Evil to me conveys dark intentions. And that isn't what I see. But I do believe information is power, the concentration of power in a single institution does raise some interesting questions. Let me ask you to consider another thought experiment. If instead of a company, a single government agency, and let's not make it the Homeland Security, let's just make it the Social Security Administration, knew as much about everyone as Google knows about the users who use many of Google's services, including the ones with accounts. And that's another distinction that I think gets lost in the shortened history of Google. The movement from using web search, which of course you do anonymously, doesn't require an account, to the sorts of services that do require an account by their nature, is a big shift. And let's say the Social Security Agency had as much information in all the different kinds of categories about its users as, say, heavy users of Google Apps provide Google. Would that give anybody pause? Which leads me to my grand proposal. I've got the opportunity, so I'm going to pitch my proposal. And I have a history of making ridiculously grand proposals. That's what you do as a columnist. I think Google, in order to continue on the path it has been on, is going to have to adopt what I call radical transparency, unlike anything you've ever considered. It's the only way, unlike any company of any category has ever adopted. It's the only way you will ever be able to avoid being slapped down, because what you are doing is by its nature unsettling, and triply so if our information goes into a black box, we on the outside, and we don't know what you're doing with it. And trust us is not an adequate form of reassurance. Oh yeah, I'll stop here and see if I might draw a few questions. Yes?
What is that? Oh, okay. Hi, thanks for coming. I was just wondering what you meant exactly by radical transparency. Like, what does that involve?
Fair question. What does it involve? Let's talk about Gmail. Right? One of the things I talk about in the book is how there is a great, when ads are served up, when Gmail's introduced and ads are served up, not just, it's not the presence of ads, of course, because there were ads for Yahoo Mail and Hotmail. It was the presence of ads that clearly were linked to the content of the messages. That was quite unsettling to people. And of course, there's no humans reading the mail, of course. And you can explain that till you're blue in the face, but it still made people uncomfortable. And then that seems to have passed. But there is a lingering concern that there's just one unhappy employee or one nosy employee has the requisite permissions. And I know it's not widespread, but there's got to be a core team that has access that needs to be able to reach a given user's email. How do I know that person isn't looking at my email? I was a heavy Gmail user until I started my book. And then I realized, would anyone at Google care enough about what I'm saying to my editor to sometimes take a peek? And before you laugh at me, let me point out, just this week I found great evidence, not that it happens here, but it happens in other contexts. I was reading an important medical journal, Men's Health. That said, in typical Men's Health fashion, one sentence news bite, 13% of all, what was it? 13, I'm going to mangle this, but something like 13% of all patients have had their hospital patients have had their records looked at by non-employees. I don't know where the non comes in. I'm worried about the employees. While I'm writing this book, Valleywag is filled with stories about what's going on over at Facebook, where, if these accounts are to be believed, Facebook employees entertain themselves at odd hours a day by going in and looking at the supposedly private profiles of members. I haven't heard anything about such a thing happening at Google, but how do I know it doesn't happen? So coming back to the question, radical transparency, maybe the answer is you have to have a citizens' council, non-Google people all over the place, assuring the rest of us that no one's doing something like that. Radical transparency would mean here are the 50 different things we do to make sure the data that you entrust to us cannot be misused. And here are the people who are non-Google employees who we hire. You think about the role of CPAs. Maybe we need something equivalent in terms of information, care of information, some outside agency that does an information protection audit and provides an independent means of verifying procedures in the same way we rely upon outsiders to verify accounting reporting. I would start with that. Yes?
I might have trouble getting these thoughts together. As someone who's only been at Google for 6 months, I find that the do not be evil mantra is actually really effective. I see it being used every day in every way. I don't actually know that the company doesn't have agreements with the NSA or whatever to leak information, and if they did, they wouldn't tell us. They couldn't, right? Because the government wouldn't allow them to. The issue of how can someone from the outside have the level of comfort that I do with Google, like even entrusting them with my own information. Maybe we just went through this Google Geist thing here where we tell them all sorts of things about our managers and so on, and they say, well, this really is in confidence. Do I trust them? Yes, I do, actually. I think the real issue here is how do you trust any corporation? I don't know if you've seen the movie called The Corporation, Canadian movie. It was they used the idea of the DSM-4, and they
I use the book form of that in my classes, business and society classes.
To show that corporations are basically psychotic. They're considered individuals under tax law, but they're psychotic, and they'll do anything to make a profit. I don't think Google is like that. I don't think we will do anything to make a profit. And the question is, how could you create sort of a new model for a corporation that was more like Google and that was transparently more like Google? And maybe the answer is that Google somehow needs to be a model for that and somehow figure out a way that we could actually replicate ourselves in other places so that we don't have Halliburtons and other companies like that really truly do seem to be evil, that seem to actually have a mantra: do as much evil as you can. So anyway, I'll stop there.
One of the things that I think Google's done well is handle the China question in a very transparent way, what to do in China. And as long as I see Google agonizing about, in public view, about a question, I don't think it can go too far wrong. I wish all companies agonized in public view. But I don't see the similar internal debate made visible for some other issues. I'll give you one that I don't think is a model, and that's what's happened with BookScan, or the book scanning project. The Open Content Alliance, the OCA, which was formed with Brewster Kahle, Yahoo, Microsoft as an alternative in parallel book scanning project, tried to enlist the same research libraries to provide their project with copies, with books that they would scan, and their differentiation was they were going to make those scans available to anyone. And the project quickly ran into difficulties. Besides being underfunded, they could not marshal the resources that Google could. But they ran into, more immediately, this problem. Many of the copies of the books were in such frail condition that the libraries would not let those books out more than once to be scanned. And Google would sign them up. So Google was scanning these books that could not be scanned a second time. And Google's scans are not made available to anyone else. And Kahle argued, and I think perfectly legitimately, that Google was taking public resources, a number of these participating libraries are public universities, and turning their collections into a privately held digital repository. Now, if Google had some qualms about this, if Google wrestled with this question of should we make those scanned images available to others, I would love to know about that. That would be a form of transparency that would make me feel better about what Google's doing.
Hi, just to respond a little bit to your last example. The OCA didn't scan anything that was out of copyright, and Google was basically saying we're going to scan it all. The copyright laws really were not appropriate for the digital world, and they will be changed. But the business about these old books, you can download PDFs of probably virtually all of them. So
where do those PDFs get created?
they're created by Google. So if you go to the site, you can just download the PDFs. So it's just like an ebook of all those old books, pre-1923.
Well, right. So we're talking about the books.
That same set.
Hey, John.
Hi, Randy. First of all, thanks very much for coming. We appreciate your time and your insights. I would offer for your consideration that there are certain companies out there that have way more information about users than Google. If you look at Visa, American Express, they know what people are doing with their credit cards, where they happen to be located when they're doing it, that type of thing. Not to defend necessarily financial services companies in this day and age, but what I wanted to ask from you are, when those sort of companies arose and people filled out the applications and they send it in and get credit cards and then they get spending reports back in the end of the year, obviously if any of those companies were to have a major breach of their security, information security, that would be problematic for everyone in this room and people on a worldwide basis. Are there any learnings that we could take as a company from what those companies do in terms of protecting information, or from the perspective of the way that they build public trust?
Those are provocative examples. You're right, it's very sensitive. Although I'd argue if Google Checkout takes off, it'll be right there. I believe in both cases, both MasterCard and in the case of Visa, they were both companies that were formed by banks. So they're kind of consortia run on behalf of their members. I don't know if that makes it a little less sensitive. And so instead of being in the hands of a single company, it's a company that has members. I mean, Visa did go public recently, but So it kind of ruins my argument. But until then, it was more kind of nonprofit on behalf of for-profit companies. Here's where Google's case is different. They know our purchase histories, and that could tell you a lot, obviously. But it's just that. And Google's reach is so comprehensive. It's the spanning of domains that makes its story unique. Suppose Visa went into the health records business and the email business and just start building out. Would that give you pause? Isn't it enough that they know so much about what we buy? One of the things Google has done very well is establish this brand that is synonymous with information. And there are a number of Google products that aren't being monetized. They're just offered for the better good, disseminating information. But they very effectively reinforce the notion that Google's the place to go. Every user, as Google loves to tell us, Google can lose its customers. We're just a click away from going to the competition. But human nature being what it is, we do tend to stick to a single site and all of its array of services. Theoretically, I could guard against Google knowing too much about me by doing my web searches over at Microsoft Windows Live Search and signing up for Yahoo Mail and making sure I distribute this information you've heard me say so much about how sensitive it is, distributed across all these companies. So no single company. But I'm not going to do that, and no one I know is going to do that. You become comfortable with a single provider. You don't mix and match. So even though theoretically I could, I don't. So my reluctance to exercise my freedom to choose among many players is going to become your problem at Google. So whatever concerns I have about the black box will become your concerns. This is all being played out, I think, in the investigations of the Google Yahoo ad deal, which is not just here, it's not just the many states' attorneys general, it's Canada, it's Europe. I've written about this in my column. I don't think the ad deal is a major concern, but I think there's, from society's perspective. But if it's not this, it's going to be something else that becomes a focal point. When you become a very successful company in a short amount of time, you make a lot of enemies. And those enemies will find an issue that is a vulnerability. And it's too soon to know whether this deal is going to be one of those. But were Google to find itself in the bog of antitrust defense, defending itself against antitrust action, as the example of Microsoft shows, just about everything you're doing now will have to be rethought, all corners of the company. And I think the free-floating concern about one entity, which is in the private sector, holding information, and no matter how each of you sees the company operating in an ethical, principled way, won't matter, especially if you're not a perfectly transparent company. So this free-floating concern, I would argue, if it masses and then crystallizes, it could create a company-changing event.
Randy, I'm
Yeah.
really intrigued by the notion of the ombudsman or the citizens committee that somehow is going to review and okay what Google does. And I like a lot of things about that idea, but you also mentioned that Google would pay these people ideally, and media companies do this. They have ombudsmen who are often critics, and that's legitimately recognized. I have a feeling that we couldn't do that in order to have this radical transparency you're talking about. So I'm just trying to think about what scenarios.
I bet you could get volunteers.
Would they?
Have it be university-based. Have an assembly, have an academic advisory council, staffed with, we'll just say, limit it to computer science departments to go over procedures and protections. They wouldn't require stipends, I would think. I don't know. Hey, Matt?
Hey, really interesting stuff. I've really been enjoying the book so far, and I think the notion of radical transparency definitely gives us a lot of Googlers something to think about. I wanted to ask about a slightly different point. You had a really interesting chapter in the book about the algorithm, and you rightly identified, Yahoo using human editors for its directory put a limit on its scalability, and that meant that in many ways Google had a lot of advantages on growing in its first several years. And I was curious if you see limits to the algorithm, and sort of wanted to get your take on, do you think that algorithmic approach ultimately limits Google, and whether we need to be open to more human interaction and other ways of opening up, or does the algorithm reach a plateau at some point and you need to go beyond just machines?
A later chapter, I think it's the last chapter, is Algorithm Meet Humanity, where I do talk about just this question and the many attempts to build upon the results, the algorithmic results. One of the things that strikes me about Google's indexing of the web is that in some ways it was the easiest category, if you think about all that's come since, because you've got link analysis, you've got basically all these rich, well-considered judgments that other people have made that you can utilize. And just compare kind of the algorithm at work on the web and the algorithm at work on YouTube. Searching on YouTube doesn't get you very far. It poses all sorts of questions about how far the algorithm can go. Now, I know that this audio search has just been introduced for the political channels and offers the opportunity to do keyword searching of content, but seems like we're a long, long ways from having the algorithm being able to sense this video is much more important than that video. Some of the other areas that have tried to build upon the algorithm, you have social search, you have still another attempt at semantic-based search. So far, I haven't seen results that are impressive. But as I write about in the book, and you feature in that part when I talk about Mahalo, the notion that you can build upon, so it's not either or, but you can build upon algorithmic search results, I think makes a lot of sense. But I can't predict what direction the next breakthrough will come in.
So you've written about Steve Jobs, right? So are there, so Apple and Next and companies are in a somewhat different space than Google, but so ignore that for a moment. Just looking at company culture and how Steve Jobs and or Larry and Sergey have created a culture. You know, are they very different? Are they very similar? You know, I read articles saying, oh, they're both innovative companies, they foster innovation, but I've also seen articles that say, oh, they're completely different. You know, Steve. So what is your take?
Are we comparing Google and Next or Google and Apple?
Let's say Apple.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't want to be compared to Next. That was not a happy experience for anyone involved. I think the biggest difference in these two companies is how Apple has, since Steve Jobs' return to the company, become a very savvy marketer to consumers. It's not a profound thought. And one of the things I think Google needs to realize, and as I banged away on my last column on Sunday, talking about the absence of 800, free 800 phone support. So you are in also, you're marketing to consumers, but you don't think of yourselves as doing so. If search ads apps is really the guiding light, that apps part, unless you're really just going to sell to the enterprise, you've got to develop a comfort thinking about how to reach consumers that you've never had to do before. We consumers have come to you. We've been incredibly happy with search results, happy with the ads. But as we sign up for things like Google Apps, or start to use Google Checkout, or entrust you with Google Health records, or some of the other services, the computer science ethos that this company was founded with is not going to be a good match. And Apple has, if you look at its entire history, obviously it's had to think a lot about marketing, but of course in the most recent 12 years has done such a fine job of paying attention to reaching consumers. And even though I talk about Google as the company that runs these massive data centers, and I talk about the algorithm, all that should be hidden. I mean, one of the lessons of Steve Jobs' career is complexity should be hidden, that the best design project makes complexity disappear, and the best products are the simplest for the consumer, what the consumer experiences. And one of the things Google will, of course, continually wrestle with is how to make sophisticated products that are easy to use. The whole issue about authentication and what a user goes through if they've screwed up and they can't get into their account, they haven't followed the Google guidelines of having a secondary email account that isn't Gmail, they haven't provided security question and answer, and they say, let me in, and Google says, we'll prove you are who you say you are. Well, a solution to this kind of predicament, a little preventive solution, would be you demand that every account holder provide either security questions or some other set of information that would allow you to verify they are who they say they are. But that's complexity, and you will scare off users. And in the course of my interviews for this little piece on this subject, the Google team member said, we're balancing complexity and simplicity. The ideal is you somehow manage to build in the complexity, but you insulate your user. So it remains a simple experience across the board, all products. So coming back to your question about comparing the cultures of the two companies, Apple has fine engineers, but I think members of the public don't think of that first and foremost if you ask them about what image do you have of Apple. And I think that's part of their success.
Going back to your statements about radical transparency, a couple questions. One, following up on Karen's question about some sort of citizens' council or outside verification. How would Google create something like that and fund it, and yet have it maintain a semblance of independence and not just be some great marketing ploy? And then the second question I have is, how do you balance radical transparency with the need to protect intellectual property?
Okay. Let me start with the second one first, and then get to the first question. So how do you balance with proprietary information? You've got to let go of it. You're going to have to let go of the notion of protection of what you define as proprietary information is the most important goal. I mean, every company naturally is inclined to build the wall and protect it, but I would argue you've got to let go. The whole world of open source perhaps should provide some measure of comfort that companies share incredible amounts of information, or I should say developers. These projects share incredible amounts of information, and there's still companies that can build profitable businesses, maybe not on the scale of Google's, doing things that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, would have been considered heretical and impossible. How can you do that? How can you share such enormous amounts of information that should be properly regarded as proprietary? Maybe you define the proprietary wall, instead of being out here, just around here. There have been people who have proposed that Google share its index. They just put that out in the public domain and compete on the basis of how well you utilize that index. Maybe that sounds just preposterous. But it might stretch your mind a little. There have been those proposals outside of Google. I don't know if there have been any within Google. But I don't think there's anything proprietary in saying, and I think they're coming back to the first question, like how would this be funded, who would actually do it? Either take my proposal of having an academic council of CS professors, or go to someone like one of the big four and say, we're going to hire you. You hire, in the same way you hire a CPA, and they've got their reputation to protect. And thanks to Sarbanes-Oxley, they can't hold the contract for more than 5 years. And they come in and they do information integrity audits. And maybe for a company this size, they have someone on the premises all the time. I don't know what you need to keep secret if we're talking about things like, all right, who is permitted to look at a given user's email, the contents of a given user's email? Who's on that list? What does it take to be on that list? Do we have procedures in place that record every time an employee actually looks at a user's email? And can I look and see what they looked at? And are the procedures requiring them to tell us why they had access to that person's account? That would be a form of transparency that I think would be very reassuring to all Gmail users. And I don't think it would be cost prohibitive, any more than hiring a CPA firm is cost prohibitive. That's what I have in mind.
Just to pick up on that point a little bit, Google, I was just looking at the Q2 results for the company. It was made public in Q2 that the majority of our revenue is now from overseas, so 52% of our revenue. We operate in a great many countries. Many of our products work in our 40 languages, and I'm sure that'll grow in time. So the idea of some kind of council of citizenry may be somewhat complicated by that fact. No doubt about it, it would be very complicated by that. But that's not my main question. My main question is, I'm guessing your book made print before it was made public that we launched Chrome. And I'd like to get your thoughts on Chrome. It's an open source project. There are already versions. There's a version called Iron, which strips out all the Google functionality. And you can download and install that if you like. So just if you could talk perhaps for a couple of moments about Chrome and how you see that sort of panning out, I'd be interested.
Okay. I didn't have the chance to talk about Chrome in the book. I've tried it out. I found some parts of its design frustrating, so I'm not using it on a daily basis. I just explored it. Perhaps I should go back and give it more time. It seems to me that Chrome is an interesting project in that obviously there's no, it's a product that is not offered to make a profit from. And I think the combination of Chrome plus Android might be the most interesting implementation. And it's too early to see how that would work. I think the notion of speeding up, say, JavaScript is something that the competing browsers will be able to match. And it's easy to speculate that Chrome is not going to be able to have much of an impact. It's just kind of an intellectual stimulation. Some survey I saw that was done a few days ago suggested that the number of people who are using Chrome has actually fallen down a little bit from the levels that it reached shortly after its introduction. It's very hard, especially given the existence of Firefox, to enter the browser market with an alternative. I'm not sure what the pitch would be, especially if the competition matches it in performance. My understanding is it really is, it's a performance, its offering is related to performance, and it probably will not be able to offer a lead that it will be able to protect. I think whenever Google offers a product that is intended to make our use of information that is stored in the cloud easier, faster, more convenient, wherever we are with whatever device we happen to hold, it again does a good job of associating in the user's mind Google information, information Google. So it doesn't have to gain a lot of market share to make its own little contribution to this association in the public's mind.
I have a question about the title of the book and how you came up with it versus Future 2.0.
The Future 2.0 was a placeholder suggested by my editor, I think, way at the beginning, which I thought was awful for many reasons. One is, as much as great as my hopes are for the book will be interesting and cover a lot of ground, I don't pretend to cover the future. And 2.0, I worried about being, so I started this book in 2006. And I was of course, I was worried that Web 2.0 would be long over by the time the book came out. So that wasn't going to work. I wanted something very plain, something like Google and Google and the future of everything we know, something like that. So that way I worked in future, no adjectives, just very plain. And the publisher refused to accept this, said you've got to have adjectives. So they want a bold. I said bold's for tide or cheer. let's do audacious. And they said, good, good, good. And I said, but no, I take it back. No, no, you said it. So that's how we ended up with this.
Thank you very much for
Thank
coming,
you.
Randy.